probably heard that you're more likely to develop things like schizophrenia and bipolar and depression if you use trees as a teen. And there's a giant new study that just provides even more support for this idea. So are you more likely to develop psychiatric disorders later on if you use weed earlier? And the answer to that is yes, but that's not the question that you should be asking. The question that we'd want to ask if we could is, does weed use actually cause later disorders? And we don't know that. So this is all just a giant debate. So let me explain what we actually know from the perspective of a drug scientist. But first, let me explain the study that's getting a ton of attention right now so you know what it does and does not say. Researchers did a retrospective study. So what they did is they looked at like health insurance records. And they looked at health insurance records from 13 to 17-year-olds and kind of looked at them over time. And the questions they were interested in were, are you diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder? And in the past year, did you use weed? So this is one of the questions they actually asked during the wellness visits. And so they were looking to see, does an answer to that question lead to later psychiatric diagnosis? And what they found was pretty consistent with the previous research. So they saw that past year use of weed was linked to things like an increased likelihood of having psychotic disorders, depression, bipolar, and anxiety. Now, psychotic disorders and bipolar had kind of like the strongest links there, which is also very true of what we found in the past too. So there's something with like weed and psychosis. Now, this study has some positives and it has some flaws. So first positive, it has a ton of people. Like looking at 460,000 adolescents is a good N. Like you should be able to see differences. And even when they're using a variable that is only yes or no, so it's less likely to show differences in it, they did still find differences, suggesting that it's a pretty strong effect. And the fact that they were like tracking these kids from like 13 to 17 to later ages. Now, to be fair, it was retrospective, so it wasn't done like year after year. It was just looking at their past data, but they still were able to see kind of these long-term effects. So same people over the years, what is actually happening to that individual across time. Now, as is true for most of these studies, the major flaw is they're using like survey and self-report questionnaire. So you're asking teenagers to admit that they're using drugs, and in some cases potentially do this in front of their parents. Like you're asking 14 to 17-year-olds. Now, to be fair, I don't remember if I had my parents with me at those doctor's visits at that time. So let me know if that's a relatively common practice. Were your parents there at your doctor's visits when you were answering these questions? Let me know. But if the parents were there, that causes a huge problem because now you're answering these questions in front of your parents. So the people who are more likely to answer yes probably have parents who are potentially more okay with it. And we know that what your parents think about drug use strongly changes what you think about drug use. Another major problem is that it was basically only one question. Have you used weed in the last year? It's not asking about things like potency. It's not asking about things like how often. It's not asking about things like why. It is just asking, did you use this in the past year? Like, did you use this in the last year can mean anything. It can mean I use this every day in the past year, or I used this once and hated it. They specifically found that age actually matters, and this is true for a lot of the other studies too. So what they found is that the older that you were when you started use, the less likely you were to develop things like depression and anxiety. You're still more likely to develop them if you had used earlier on, but the later that you started is linked to having less of a potential effect on things like depression and anxiety. And other studies found that, like, if you started using around the age of 17 or later, that was not necessarily linked to, like, an increased incidence of having psychosis. It seems like before 17 might be particularly problematic. Now, there's a huge problem with this too, in that we're not really looking at people's different ages of starting this. So we can't do a good ethical study on this. We can't make people start using weed at the age of 13 or 14 or 15 or 16 versus like 17, 18, 19 to see if they are more likely to develop psychosis. So you're just relying on what people think the important ages are. So you're relying on like some people saying that like earlier age of onset is before the age of 16. Some people say that 17 matters, but there's like no one standard age. So it just seems like all we can say is like the earlier you start using it, the worse it seems to be. And when you're an adult, whatever adult means, is that age of consent, or when you can vote, or when you can drink? Who knows what adult means? But if you start using it as an adult, you're probably less likely at risk. But yes, we do know that drugs during development are potentially particularly problematic. That was really hard to say, by the way. So I've done research on like early adolescent use of antipsychotics. That could be problematic. Like we know that the brain is still developing. And so in this case, the endocannabinoid system is like especially expressed during teenage years. So there's a lot of activity there, and the endocannabinoid system, so that's what weed is working on, that seems to be linked to basically like all of the changes. So we're talking about like the memory changes, the like desire to eat food and how it tastes better, how music sounds different when you're high, or things like emotional regulation. All of those are linked to the endocannabinoid system. And so all of those could potentially be kind of dysregulated if you're using this too early. This entire topic is controversial because we don't have causal evidence. We can't do the experiments to actually test this. So all we have is this correlational data. And the correlational data can be skewed by so many different things. So for example, there's this idea that males are more likely to use weed, and males are also more likely to use it earlier on, and males are more likely to have psychotic disorders. So what this can mean is that maybe people are just more likely to develop psychotic disorders because males are more likely to use this drug and they do it early on and then they later develop this disorder. And there's this entire bit about like prodromal symptoms. So if you're not familiar with prodromal symptoms, what they basically are is they're symptoms that appear before the actual diagnosable disorder appears. So kind of like pre-symptoms, if you want to think of them that way. So things that we see in people that suggest that they might later develop the disorder, but have not officially met the diagnosis. So maybe people who have those prodromal symptoms are more likely to use weed, either to do things like self-medicate or just because they're more sensitive to it because of those symptoms. And therefore, they're more likely to develop disorders later on because they kind of already had the disorder earlier. And then this study also found that people who have a high neighborhood deprivation index, if you lived in a bad neighborhood, you are more likely to then use weed earlier on. But then also that high neighborhood deprivation is strongly linked to things like the likelihood of developing depression and anxiety and psychosis. So how are you taking out that potential aspect? We can't right now because we can't do the experiments. So yes, there is a very strong link between early use of weed and then later risk of developing disorders like psychosis and depression, particularly psychosis and bipolar. So is this something you should be worried about? Yes. Should you recommend that people not use drugs until after they've kind of grown up a little bit? Yes, because in general, like, we don't make great decisions when we're younger anyway, so maybe you want to start making those decisions later on. But like, is this a guarantee that you're later going to have a disorder? No, and we should not be speaking about it that way.